Здравейте, драги зрители! With Xenos Month done, we'll be returning to everyone's favorite Space Marine content. And because I apparently can't beat the heretic allegations based on the previous videos, it'll be about the Traitor Legions. Rather than presenting an excavated good, today we'll go over the digging process itself. In this video, I'll be doing a review of the very first Warhammer novel I ever went through, namely, 1,000 Suns by author Graham McNeill. First, we'll go over a quick summary of the story that takes place in its pages, followed by the review itself, blending it with some analysis of certain aspects of it. Advanced spoiler warning, in the case that you wish to read the book first before continuing. With all that out of the way, follow me as we delve into the... Its opening takes us to Agoru, a planet where the veil between the warp and real space is very thin, which attracted the attention of Magnus the Red, Primarch of the 15th Legion, resulting in him splitting his forces away from the overall Crusade battle group in that cluster of space, and coming to said world. Their attention would specifically be focused on a titanic mountain of black stone, described as greater in its dimensions than Olympus Mons on Mars, which appeared to be pulled up from the Earth, likely by the ancient alien civilization that previously dwelled upon Agoru, rather than it being a naturally formed landmark. In addition to its unnatural presence and form, the Thousand Suns discovered that the mountain's very surface has a dampening effect on psychic powers, causing their tutelaries, minor warp entities the scholars of Prospero have bonded with, to scatter away from it, while also exhibiting what a mortal would call supernatural phenomena. Namely that, once per year, the native people of Agoru bring all of their dead to a special cavern found high up the mountain, flanked by two titanic statues of alien design. And every year, when they return, all of the bodies previously brought are gone. Because of this, Magnus calls it the mountain that eats men, notably excited to learn its secrets. Other than the Astartes, their expeditionary fleet contains contingents of mortals, predominantly regiments of the Prospero Spire Guard, but also remembrancers, among which we follow a group consisting of 3 unsanctioned psychers: Lemuel Gauman, a man of minor nobility capable of seeing other people's auras and thus reading their emotions and behaviors; Camille Shivani, a lady with a skill that shows her the history and lives of those who made anything she touches as if she was living it herself; and Callista Eris, a woman plagued by cryptic but fairly accurate visions of the future, imposed upon her at great cost in the form of crippling physical pain. One such prophetic episode of hers warns the Thousand Suns of the arrival of the 5th Company of the Space Wolves, sent by their lord, Leman Russ, to command Magnus away from this compliant planet and back on the warpath. A missive they delivered rather belligerently, practically forcing Magnus to frighten them into courteousness with his psychically enhanced Primarch aura, with their company captain declaring that they would remain on-world until the Crimson King's investigation was done. It would culminate with the discovery that the bizarre mountain was seemingly put atop a webway gate with the intent to keep something in it sealed. Disturbed by the Agoru people's sacrifice of their dead, misguidedly thinking that they were appeasing whatever slumbered below to keep it contained, but were in truth empowering it until it broke out during the 2 legions' visit. The formerly mentioned statues were in actuality Xenos Titans, seemingly left to stop the imprisoned entity should it ever liberate itself. Awoken by the disturbance of the prison, they attacked the first thing that came before them. In this case, that was the united force of the Thousand Suns and Space Wolves, who readily did battle with them, although at heavy cost to their numbers. During this fight, Magnus himself was nearly killed by one of the Titans, but was saved by Phocis Takar of the Raptora cult, who erected a psychic barrier fueled by nearly his entire life essence, right before the Colossus's weapon discharged. Immediately after clearing the path to the mountain's inner sanctum, the Suns and Wolves rushed in, only to be greeted by the awakened demonic entity that began to assault them, even taunting the Crimson King with supposed falsehoods of prophecy, until Magnus banished and resealed it. While not in satisfactory fashion, the 15th Legion's business on the planet was completed, and they would follow the remaining 5th Company back to the expeditionary fleet's greater whole. During their stay on Agoru, the company's rune priest, Othir Weirdmake, would save Ahriman from an assault of warp predators, as he had tried projecting his soul into the Great Ocean for a longer period of time than normal before the demon's awakening. This encounter would spark the beginning of a friendship between the two, which Azek's father would endorse. Also stemming from the Crimson King's instruction was the induction of the aforementioned trio of Remembrancers into direct commune with the Thousand Sons' Legion, with Ahriman being appointed to teach Lemuel how to use his abilities without endangering himself to the predations of the warp. All of this due to Magnus seeing potential in him. As expected, just like any other Remembrancer, none of them could decline the opportunity to witness and record a Legion's deeds more up close and personal. However, complications would arise that would make them doubt the fortune of such a boon. For starters, they would have to reveal their hidden abilities to one another, though that served to deepen the three's friendship. More worrisome was their meeting with and subsequent addition of Magnus's personal scribe, Mahavashtu Kalimakis, to their group. On his own, he was a delightful old man who made for pleasant company, but he himself appeared withered, less so from age, but from a strange affliction. He had, apparently, scribed out countless pages in a language he could not understand, but remembered none of it, despite medical testing showing nothing wrong with his mind, which led to his emotional and thus physical degradation. Most terrifying of all, however, had to be what they had bargained for, seeing Astartes' warfare up close. On a world called Shrike, in reference to the great avian predators used by its native population to resist the onslaught of the Space Wolves, Thousand Sons, and Wordbearers, they would pay witness to a couple of direct meetings between Magnus and Leman Russ. The first appeared jovial and friendly, but the second was far from it. It was brought on by the 15th Legion defending a great library that the 6th wanted to destroy. It had been possibly the first time when Astartes openly attacked fellow Astartes and blood was drawn. In the heat of that engagement, the Thousand Sons would again feel the tug of the flesh change, the genetic defect stemming from their psychic potential, which nearly rendered them extinct. Hastar of the Sons' Pavoni cult lost himself to his power, and his body was devolved into a grotesque heap of flesh bursting out of its armor. Before Magnus could somehow help his son, Russ killed him with a single bolt from his sidearm. Both Primarchs nearly leapt upon each other, but the cataclysm of their fury was delayed by their brother Lorgar stepping between the two and calming them down enough for the pair to break apart. The Wolf Lord and his legion would be the first to leave the planet. The Crimson King and his sons would do the same only after recovering every piece of knowledge from the world's archives and repositories, assisted by Camille Shivani's ability. They would participate in the Triumph of Ulanor, where the Emperor announced his leave of the Great Crusade and the ascension of his favorite son, Horus Lupercal, to the rank of War Master, but afterwards awaited them a far more personally pivotal event. During his training with Lemuel, Azek would receive portents of it. Regrettably, however, given how unexpected the coming developments were to him, when the 15th Chief Librarian finally deciphered said portents, it was too late. The Council of Nicaea, a supposed conclave to determine the use and existence of Psykers in the Astartes legions in the coming future, given how the Great Crusade had nearly concluded in victory. In truth, it had turned into the trial of Magnus the Red and his sons. Othir Weirdmake would accuse them of witchery, naming them warlocks and necromancers, betraying the now clearly false friendship with Ahriman by using what they had exchanged in confidence to sabotage the Thousand Sons. An endeavor in which he was eagerly joined by the Primarch of the Death Guard, Mortarion, a known hater of Psykers and opponent of the Librarius institution founded by Magnus, Sanguinius, and Jagatai Khan, along with a chorus of other voices left unnamed in the story. Despite the opposition given by Magnus' side and the Emperor's alleged aversion to the event as a whole, in the end it was decided for the Librarius to be disbanded, with all psychically gifted Astartes to return as rank-and-file brothers, while the Crimson King and his sons were banned from continuing their study of the warp by the declared penalty of enmity by the Master of Mankind himself to anyone who would use psychic powers other than the sanctioned astropaths and navigators. Alas, said prohibition would be disregarded, because near the end of the Council of Nicaea, Magnus would be imposed upon by the entity he had bargained with for the power and knowledge to save his legion from the flesh change. At that moment, it poisoned his mind with the insinuation that Horus would be led to betray the Emperor, something that the Crimson King could scarcely believe and would not allow to take place. Retiring back to Prospero, he and his legion would undertake two great rituals. With the first, Magnus attempted to reach Horus and save him from the trap that would take him down the path of treachery. Unfortunately, his efforts would be undermined by Erebus of the Wordbearers, so he instead attempted the second in order to send his psychic self in the Imperial Palace on Terra so he could warn his father. In the process of doing so, however, he would break through the webway wall the Master of Mankind had been working on, practically destroying humanity's future. Realizing this, and feeling the Emperor's anger shocked him so much that he failed to deliver any kind of warning, leaving him with the belief that himself, his sons, and their home of Prospero would be punished for this sin, and that they should perish for it. To ensure this, he would block the scrying abilities of everyone on the planet, preventing them from glimpsing the incoming disaster. Except for Callista Eris, who was hospitalized due to an outburst of her power that foretold the coming of the Space Wolves before Magnus's failure. She would regrettably die from her curse as the Thousand Sons later induced more of them in her, trying to get as much information to prepare for the coming invasion. Rightfully disgusted and fearing for their lives, doubly so after discovering that Magnus had essentially puppeteered his scribe, Mahavashtu Callimachus, to write down all of the mysterious texts and then robbing him of the memories, the remainder of her friends plotted an escape off of Prospero before it came to ruin. They would succeed in making it to a ship that departed the planet, but the last we hear of them is that after they left the gravity well, their ship's alarm blares, just as the Space Wolves fleet translates above them. Finally, the story ends with the calamitous spectacle that is the burning of Prospero. The diminished Thousand Sons giving it their all to protect their home. Ahriman even avenged the betrayal of Othir Weirdmake by dragging his soul out of his body and into the Materium, where he dispelled his defenses and left his spirit to be torn apart by warp predators. Despite their colossal efforts, the combined force of Space Wolves, Custodes, and Sisters of Silence was simply too great to be fended off. Overcome by his conscience, Magnus at last joined the battle, seemingly halting the entire enemy advance by himself with stunning displays of his psychic might. That was, until Leman Russ rushed to the fore and engaged him. The brothers' clash was cataclysmic, reality appearing to unmake itself from the raw power both existed. But, despite being grievously injured by him, the Wolf King triumphed over his Cyclopean brother and broke him across his knee. The Lord of Prospero barely had enough time to spirit away his few surviving sons and what little remained of his home civilization before his brother ended him. Those remaining Thousand Sons found themselves in a world apparently submerged in the warp, later dubbed the Planet of the Sorcerers. They would wander its surface for an unknown span of time until a black tower, similar to the mountain of Agoru, erupted from the ground, and from it descended Magnus the Red, but changed, supposedly ascended past his material form and into an immortal one made out of the very stuff of the great ocean. From then on, their Primarch would marshal and lead them again, but the tale of that is beyond the conclusion of this story. I suppose it goes without saying that I really enjoyed this book. Getting to learn more about the Thousand Sons in depth before they turned into walking dustbins and cartoonish villains was an enthralling experience, mired in suspense. Because their story is tied to so many key events in the setting, most people, including myself, already know it. Yet, from its beginning, this book shows them in such a charming and noble light that makes you wonder how they end up the way they do later on. In particular, I wish to credit Graham McNeil's writing for at times making me hope against hope that they would just pivot the correct way and not actually falter, even though with each page, the reality of the lore reassured itself more and more. The only real complaint I have regarding the writing format would be the story structure. A bit of a pivot, but I can't help but make the comparison to the game Darksiders 2. Those of you who have played it probably also made the same connection while listening to the story summary. Namely that its first half was fairly wide and expansive, but the latter portion, despite going over incredibly significant events, felt rushed and significantly smaller, as if hurrying to get to the end. That exact sentiment maps out near perfectly to A Thousand Sons as well. Though in its defense, there is the caveat that the book's first half goes into detail about the various cults and culture of the 15th Legion, as well as introducing the points of view of both Magnus and Azek Ahriman, all of which are things that do not need to be retreaded after being laid out once. Of course, there are also all of the roundabout descriptions of certain things meant to give them a mysterious aura, when it's obviously just Eldar stuff. artifacts of ancient graceful warriors capable of powerful screaming, slender, unnaturally maneuverable titans, but it was the Webway Gate reveal that should have given it all away. But the second biggest contributor to the expanded feeling of A Thousand Suns' beginning are the band of psychically gifted remembrancers we meet. I will admit, since this was my first book into 40k, I went into it with a bit of a kaiju movie mentality, since the Primarchs can technically be considered as such. And by that I mean that I just wanted the big angry things hitting each other, and believed that any small people being shoved around them would just bore and annoy me. Unlike any of the summer blockbusters of the last decade, however, A Thousand Suns flips that notion completely, as that trio, and later on quartet, came to be my favorite characters whose perspective we got to see from the entire book. All of them had delightful personalities, and their friendship felt properly genuine. The bit of banter they had when revealing their psychic gifts to each other was by far the funniest moment in the entire story for me, as well as giving us a human perspective interacting with the Astartes, thus providing more insight into the Legion and their culture. Particularly, during one of Lemuel and Ahriman's private sessions, the chief librarian shares some wine that he himself had cultivated with the Remembrancer, revealing that the Marines of the Thousand Suns pursue various non-martial activities, since they would need something to do once the Great Crusade concludes. Gaumon had to admit with some embarrassment that he only saw the Astartes as tools for war at that moment, much to Azek's amusement. On a more general note, I love the description of life in Tisca, Prospero's capital, a seemingly perfect model for how humanity could harmoniously exist after ascending into a fully psychic species. The trio's surprise at merchants and waiters knowing what they would order just as they entered their establishments was also quite fun. Regrettably, the biggest source of sympathy for all four was their individual tragedies. Mahavashtu, a scribe of great renown, being robbed of the joys of his profession by being used as a literal puppet. Camille having to suffer the psychically predatory Psychnuan eggs manifested in her skull, then getting them burned and pulled out as they quickly grew and threatened to devour her brain. Lemuel seeking the Thousand Suns with a hope beyond hope for them or Magnus to be able to bring back his wife who had perished from illness, only to have his friends suffer at their hands. And Callista, desperate for the scholars of Prospero to help cure her curse, only to die from it by their direct enforcement, under Ahriman's supervision, her body and presumably soul literally liquefying from the raw energy of the warp being funneled into her for the barest crumb of knowledge of the coming doom she foresaw. After witnessing that, even if the wolves were not coming to the shining jewel that was Prospero, it is no surprise that the remainder of their group sought to escape the planet. Personally, I dislike that the last we see of their situation was left unclear, with just, and the Space Wolves fleet appeared. I would have added that to the list of things that rubbed me the wrong way from the book, but I've been told that that ending is more so a cliffhanger than an off-screen death, so I'm very much looking forward to the books that continue what happens to them. Speaking of said list, as much as I sing the book's praises, it wasn't all perfect. From the tale of Magnus and his son's fall, you'd expect the crux of the story to be arrogance. And yeah, there's most definitely plenty of that in the Red Boy's court, but to my perception, a bigger contributor to the entire narrative's development was hypocrisy. In, how to describe it, generational form within the Thousand Suns, namely Magnus being miffed that the Emperor doesn't tell him everything, yet he in turn doesn't tell everything to his sons, and yet again in turn, Ahriman not telling everything to Lemuel. I'd dare to argue that the Legion's fall and many other issues could have been averted if it wasn't for this colossal chain of communication failure. Of course, we can't talk about hypocrisy without mentioning King Dipshit himself, Mortarion, barging up to Magnus during the Triumph of Ulanor, then later accusing him of witchcraft and the like during the Council of Nicaea, when he himself has a weird obsession with numerology surrounding the number 7, keeping his honor guard always within 49 paces around him, not to mention his later falling to Nurgle and his legion becoming the third most sorcery-infested one. Both from lore and his personification in this book, I just cannot stand this guy. Heck, after finishing A Thousand Suns, because of a thing I hate about it, a core opinion of mine about the setting has changed. The thing I hate being that from his one appearance, stepping between Magnus and Russ on Shrike, I genuinely liked Lorgar in that moment. It shames me to say it, but the way he prevented them from ripping into each other right then and there elevated him to a actually decent person, even for a short while. And the change this elicited in me is that now that I have found at least one redeeming moment about him, I'm bumping the choir boy up in the ranking and openly declaring Mortarion as the worst Primarch, at least for me. However, and I fully acknowledge that a particular Inquisitor I know will likely gun for my ass after saying this, but the biggest hypocrisy displayed in the story, as far as I'm concerned, belongs to Leman Russ and the Space Wolves. Oh, my magic people aren't really magic. They just get gifted the power of Fenris tempered by the star. Nah, shut up. That is one of the biggest copes I've heard in the lore, especially when you take into account that the rune priests are able to perform magic, even if they're not psychers, by using enchanted items, fetishes, and funny incantations with lots of wolf in them. Okay, congratulations, you've basically given the textbook definition of a sorcerer. So to have the gall to name the 1,000 Sons warlocks and necromancers is just pathetic. Or the even bigger thing that is molding over the flesh change being the result of vile witchery, when his legion has the Wolfen curse also turning his warriors into mutated monsters. Like, I understand that this book is supposed to make Magni Magic and his boys look good, but Russ comes off as such a massively hypocritical asshole in it. I can understand why so many people are not the biggest fans of him after reading it. To cap off the negativity, with significant surprise, I have to admit that my least favorite part about the book had to be the Council of Nicaea. Going through this very first novel from the setting taught me an important lesson. While the memes spread around the community can be very funny, they can also severely distort the reality of the lore. As full disclosure, before reading the story, I thought the event went something like this from the scattered pieces of lore I had been exposed to. The accusers begin with their accusations, then rebuttals come from the various other gathered parties that align with Magnus, save for Sanguinius and Fulgrim, who remained quiet because they did not like the way Magnus was presenting himself. During that came the testimony of the absolutely based White Scar Stormseer Targutai Yasuge, who basically said, "What has been said against psychic powers is bullshit. Here's several good reasons why it is bullshit. If you dare call me a liar, 1v1 me right now, I'm ready to throw hands," to a room full of haters, among which Primarchs, in front of the Emperor, and that from this the council was going well. But right at the end, Magnus comes on, and instead of bringing up a proper defense with evidence, he just retells the allegory of the cave, but twisting the ending in a somewhat self-aggrandizing way, thus fumbling the trial and resulting in the Legion Psychers being banned. But that is not the case. The proper sequence of events in the book, without the distortion of memes, is that first Othir Weirdmake comes to the fore and makes his treacherous move. Then Mortarion steps in to support him by telling a personal anecdote of how his legion fought some cornate cultist on some backwater, which summoned demons and gave them trouble, accusing the 1,000 Sons of doing the same things as them. At that point, we are taken off-screen, since Magnus accidentally knocks Ahriman out, and he was our POV character for these chapters, via his anger at the nonsense being spoken leaking out slightly. From Magnus, we learn that during Azic's imposed nap time, a cavalcade of other basically haters have dumped their own primitive accusations out against them. With them done, it is at that point that Magnus steps forth to give his 2 cents on the matter, not at the end of the conclave. And here's the biggest difference from the memes. He is actually genuinely compelling in his testimony. Both his address of the crowd, talking about how great explorers and scholars from Terra's past had been maligned by the sitting powers of their time, and weaving the modified retelling of the cave allegory, were simply put correct and spectacularly presented. So much so that Sanguinius, Fulgrim, and many in the arena give him a standing ovation for it. Then, near the ending of the council, is when Yasuge, with the chief librarians of 12 other legions backing him up, speaks his mind. A funny side note on that, it greatly amused me to see the chief librarians of the Salamanders and the Night Lords standing side by side for this. It brings me great joy to see my 2 favorite legions collaborating on something. But back to the council itself. The main reason I dislike it is because from what was presented, to me it made no sense why the Emperor would rule against Magnus. The defending arguments we get to hear both from him and the librarians are drastically better and more convincing than those of the detractors. Sanguinius and Fulgrim being on board with it should have boosted it beyond the finish line, because they, along with Magnus, are significantly more important to a great many things than fucking Mortarion is. So at least to me, his voice should have been discarded against such opposition. In fact, the three of them are so important that I'd say, given Weirdmake and the Wolves' obvious hypocrisy on the matter, it would make more sense to tell Russ to sit his ass down and chill on this matter, rather than taking his side. And as a cherry on top, despite keeping his face hidden from the crowd via blinding golden light shrouding it, both Magnus and Ahriman are able to peer past it and read on the Emperor's face that, quote, he doesn't want this, end quote. From everything presented, it should have been a done deal to go along with Magnus' side, or at least just slap him and tell him to not touch the warp until further notice, but most certainly not to disband the Librarius and declare hostility against those who don't. The only logical reason for this, that I can see at least, is if among the detractors against the Crimson King were also the heads of the Astra Telepathica and the Navis Nobilitae, the only organizations that, even by Mortarian's ramblings, would be allowed to keep using Psykers as a necessity for messaging and travel across the galaxy. Those are significantly more powerful lobbies, even compared to a Primarch, trying to protect their monopoly on psychic use. If it was revealed that they pressured the matter, I would understand why the Emperor would sideline the Thousand Sons in the short term, but because we don't get any information about it, I'm just left dissatisfied with the result. Contrasting that event, however, man, the ending of this book is absolute peak. It is one of the greatest tragedies of the heresy, I know, but the burning of Prospero is presented as such a stunning spectacle that I can't help but place it as the best part of the entire story. Filled with exceptional moments that hit you hard one after the other, like repeated gunshots of excitement. The sudden erasure of the serene existence in Tisca by the assaulting fleet's orbital bombardment. The thunderstrike of the Space Wolves, Custodes, and Sister of Silence's assault, and the desperate defense of the Thousand Sons, who by that point have thrown caution to the wind and unleashed their power on their enemies in a grand, gradually self-destructive display. From what I've heard and seen on the matter, most people praise the final clash between Magnus and Russ as the greatest part of the entire scene. For me, however, it is third in that regard at best. Second, without a moment of doubt, goes to the massive dose of pure schadenfreude that was the... I almost said duel, but that would imply a level of parity. No, the murder of Othir Weirdmake's treasonous ass by Azek Ahriman. Him ripping the Rune Priest's soul from his body while he was in the midst of his brother Wolves' charge, and subsequently flexing over him in the psychic scape he dragged them to, carried a hint of that Superman speech about living in a cardboard world and finally being able to cut loose to Darkseid from the old Justice League cartoon, before ending him with, "You betray my friendship, then call me a warlock and a necromancer? Fine then, I cast Deadass!" Obliterating all of the weapons and defenses of Weirdmake's soul, then leaving it to be devoured by demons, while his body suddenly just collapsed like a sack of potatoes to the surprise of all other Fenrisians. The absolute best part of the burning of Prospero, or arguably the entire book, in my opinion, goes to Calophus, commander of the Pyrrhae cult. He sent his consciousness into and awoke the warlord-class titan, Canis Vertex, melding with the God Machine's body to such an extent that he felt it truly natural, even more so than the Mechanicus princeps that get entombed in their walkers. Calophus was such a Chad that he not only dominated the machine spirit, but also, at the same time, continuously wrestled control and siphoned power from his tutelary, a fiery demon creature, keeping its desire for destruction tamed, turning himself into a one-man pyrokinetic Psi-Titan. For comparison, the way a Psi-Titan is made is by having the Princeps piloting it be a psychic blank, while powerful psychers are installed throughout the machine's chassis. And this magnificent bastard pulled the whole look off by himself as he fought against the invading forces and nearly turned the battle. He would only be stopped when one of his brothers, Feltoron, lost control over the surging torrent of warp energy channeled through his body, causing him to explode into a kilometer-wide fiery nuke, which hit the Titan. This made Calophus lose his focus and control, because of which the demon he kept in line overtook and overloaded Canis Vertex, causing the God Machine to explode itself, while burning away its former master's soul. You just can't convince me that that isn't among the coolest shit possible. Mad respect for a mad lad. Even if you went with me through this video's entirety, I really thank you for which. I still highly recommend reading A Thousand Suns yourselves, as there are lots more details that I chose to not reveal. Or, if you have already read it, do share in the comments below who are your favorite characters from it. Do you have any other favorite moments that I missed to mention? And what do you think of this book review video format? Would you like me to do more, maybe even novels not related to Warhammer, or to stick with just the 40k universe for now? I look forward to reading your thoughts. Would you kindly also smash the like button and subscribe, as I'm trying to reach 1000 subscribers by the end of the year. Thank you in advance, I really appreciate it. Until the next time we meet, I wish you a lovely rest of your day. Doviđenja.